Hello, and welcome to episode 131 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We're here today with Tom Walls, Executive Director of the Sorenson Institute for Political Leadership at the University of Virginia. Tom is the former principal at Denton's USA LLP, also a former partner with McGuire Woods Law Firm, a former professorial lecturer in law at George Washington University, as well as being a former Hill staffer for U.S. Senators Bumpers from Arkansas, Feingold from Wisconsin, and Warner from Virginia. He is also a double who from UVA. Tom, thanks so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. The first question I'd like to pose to you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Well, right now, I'm in my third month as the executive director of the Sorenson Institute here at UVA. And the work we do is to try to improve the quality of politics, essentially, in Virginia. We run several programs in which people come from both sides of the aisle and all around the state and all walks of life to participate, get to know issues and the process, but also to interact with each other. And what we're really trying to do is promote civility and trust and respect and ethics in politics in a sustained way.
So why would civility, trust, and respect be important in politics?
Well, I think they're essential to having a politics that actually works to produce results for the people, for the voters. And they're essential to trust in political leaders, which is not at a high level right now.
So there's a dearth of civility, trust, and respect in politics around the nation. And in Virginia, the Sorenson Institute is trying to bring different people together to reverse that trend and restore civility, trust, and respect in politics. Is that correct?
That's right. And we've had some success with it. The Institute was founded in 1993. It's been doing this work ever since. We now have more than 24 members of the legislature, the General Assembly, who have gone through our programs, and we're pretty well known around the state with more than 2,000 alumni. Mm-hmm. So so you've been very successful in having your graduates actually become part of the actual political infrastructure and political establishment in the state of Virginia. Sure, and that goes from the very local level up to the statewide level, and of course we've had graduates involved in politics outside Virginia as well, and in the federal government.
So is political leadership limited to elected office, or are there other roles that some of your graduates have taken in society as well that pertain to political leadership?
We welcome anybody who is interested in the political process and interested in being an active player in that. And that might mean running for office, but it might mean just being a leader in your community, being a person in business who's trying to engage with the community, any number of roles.
Right. So how is it that you got to this point? Clearly you have quite a varied history from working directly as a staffer with politicians and to being an attorney at major firms and being a professor. How is it that you tread this path? What is it that originally attracted you to becoming involved in politics as a young man and then eventually work your way up through the career that you have had?
Well, when I was a kid, it was really drummed into my head that I was a very privileged person, which is not to say we were particularly wealthy, but my family had this immigrant background, and we had found our way to the middle class, and it was really made clear to me every day that I was very lucky and I should be conscious of it. And then it came from somewhere. And so I always had a bent toward public service, and particularly toward public service in politics and government, because I really felt very fortunate, still do, that, all these opportunities had been there for me. And as I got older, I became conscious that they weren't necessarily still there for everybody. And so that sort of drove me. Right after college, I was politically active in college, even in high school. And after college, I my first jobs were all in politics. I then went to law school, where I really thought I was headed for a public interest career, but I picked up a lot of debt, and I ended up in a law firm in New York, but basically spent all my time trying to figure out how I would get out of that and back into more of a service role. And I ended up going down to D.C. and embarking on a pretty long career on Capitol Hill. The other times I've spent in the public sector have been fine, and I've been proud of them, but that was always about maybe paying the mortgage or the tuition, but later finding my way back to some kind of a service job.
Now, paying the mortgage and tuition is often something that many different Americans find themselves struggling to pay, and one part of public service is trying to find a way to help others encounter their problems. You said that you were very lucky to have many different opportunities made available for you, and that a lot of what public service means to you is making opportunities available for others. Can you take a moment and talk a little bit about some of the opportunities you are making for others or have made for others, either through your work in law firms, pro bono work, or the opportunities you make available to candidates for the Sorenson Institute?
Well, I've done a lot of things over the years. I did a fair amount of pro bono work when I was in the law firms. And then at Capitol Hill, really the whole purpose of that work was to try to advance, make a more just and healthy country, really, and to work for causes that I believed in. And I really enjoyed that work very much, and I worked for people who I believed in. And then really throughout my career, I've looked for small opportunities like a lot of people do for volunteer work and that kind of thing. Most recent one for me is just reading with a kid in a public school in D.C. when I was living there. It really was the most gratifying thing of my week, generally. I would just read with this kid, and I watched him get better at reading.
How old was this student?
Well, I was with him for 2 years. I guess he went from about 8 to 10, and it was really a great thing. I recommend it to everybody.
How did you get involved with that?
Somebody that I worked with was involved and suggested it to me. And
a Big Brother program?
No, it's just a straight reading program. You sit and you read with the student, and you help them learn how to read better and increase their comprehension and so forth. And in the process, maybe the kid will learn some other things. And I certainly learned a few things.
Yeah, how did he react? What did you learn? What was the experience like? How did you feel?
Oh, I enjoyed it very much. He was a really smart kid who hadn't had a lot of opportunities, hadn't had maybe a lot of individual attention, and he just really drank it up. He really enjoyed getting better at reading, and you could see it on his face.
Was his parents reading to him at night, or was it just you?
Well, I think there were some people in his life that were helping him, but his parents were recent immigrants and speaking another language at home, but they had the good sense to get him into a program to help his reading in English, and so that's what I did that for a few years. Really enjoyed it.
And so did you see any effects, or what were the implications of all that? Did he improve in his reading, and how did it make you feel? So it seems like that's a really concrete example of how you were able to make a concrete difference through your volunteer work, which isn't even related to your career. Just seems interesting.
Yeah, well, there's micro and there's macro. So I worked on that. That's micro, and I watched him get better at reading. There were real results there, and it was fun. Sometimes I worked on legislation in my career, where it's intended to affect millions of people, and it may take a long time, and it may take years to get it passed. You may not even get it passed. It's different. It's a different sort of process, but both are important.
So there's some pieces of legislation that you're particularly proud of, that you were able to advance, that you and your bosses at the time thought advanced the public interest?
Way back with Senator Bumpers, I worked on a civil rights bill that passed that improved some opportunities for women and other people. And then I worked at Feingold. I worked on the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform bill, which at the time seemed necessary. So it was and that was a bipartisan effort, and it was really gratifying to see that succeed. Obviously, there was some pushback on that issue later.
Why? So I know that you developed a career in the law firms, in the private sector law firms, in ethics and campaign finance. I wonder, and of course, you're now saying that you had worked on the campaign finance bill in the U.S. Congress. Why is that of interest to you? What's important about campaign finance? Why does it need to be regulated? Why does it matter how much somebody can contribute to a politician, and what kind of ethical problems were you trying to solve with that piece of legislation?
Well, that's really driven by the same things that have brought me to the job I'm in now. People need to trust what's happening in public life, what's happening in politics. So more disclosure, more efforts to make people feel like they have they understand what's going on, and that there aren't other incentives for policymakers. It's important.
So is basically the idea that policymakers ought to be motivated by what's in the public interest, and sometimes they're motivated or could be tempted to be motivated by their personal interests, let's say for re-election. And so there may be an entity or a person that contributes money to their campaign that would help them get elected, and in kind of that would make that congressman feel indebted to that contributor, and therefore potentially likely to vote against the public interest and in favor of that particular person's interest, so the politician can be more likely to get reelected. Is that kind of the quandary that campaign finance is meant to address?
Well, I think there's a lot that comes under the broad category of campaign finance, and I think, and some people take a more libertarian view of it, but I think everybody agrees you want to minimize the perception of corruption, and so even because just the existence of the perception really can poison the process. So that's what we were doing in those days, and my work now is a little bit different.
So, right. So talk to me a little bit now about the work you're currently doing and how you're making opportunities available for others. What kind of opportunities are being made available through the Sorenson Institute for people who become part of it? What are they becoming a part of? What are they gaining by participating in this institute?
Well, they become part of an effort that's pretty well established now to try to improve the politics of Virginia, and they have the opportunity to participate in some of our programs. We have a few different ones. Maybe the best known program that we have, it's called the Political Leaders Program, and PLP, and it's we invite people to apply from all over the state, all kinds of people. They might be young, they might be in the middle, or even near the end of their professional career. And we try to get a mix of people across the political spectrum as well. And they come together once a month for a weekend for 10 months, and they meet in different parts of Virginia, where they'll discuss certain issues. They'll learn about the economy of the state, the different communities in the state, understand some of the local issues, some of the statewide issues that people are wrestling with, but also engage on just the policy process itself. For example, we put them through a budget exercise where they're given a set of numbers and told to make a budget, and it becomes their responsibility to make the hard choices about where we're going to spend money, where we won't. And you can see it really informs the way people think about things. They see the complexity of it. They begin to understand better how people who are maybe on the other side of some issues are thinking. And maybe just as important as any of that, they spend a lot of time together with people they otherwise would not have spent a lot of time with. In our society right now, we tend to find ways to be among like-minded people. And at Sorenson, we push back on that phenomena, and it helps people to gain some insight. And we've seen later, when they're in the House of Delegates or on a county board or in some important public position, it makes them more receptive to, more able to understand the point of view on the other side and to finally get to a place where policy decisions are reached and people feel like their government is actually representing them.
So you're saying that a main thrust of the Sorenson Institute is a desire to have both geographic diversity and ideological diversity within each of your classes. And through the course of a year, it sounds like a lot of individuals are able to create friendships and relationships with each other even though they may be one may be from a rural area, one may be from an urban area, one may be from conservative, one may be from a liberal area. And then what are the effects of those friendships in society, or especially in the legislature? Have you evaluated any of the effects of those relationships? I mean, what has been the impact?
Sure. We have, by the way, your description is accurate, but I would add that we seek more or less every sort of diversity. But as you say, you might get somebody from a rural county in Southwest Virginia and somebody from a more urban county in Northern Virginia or over in Richmond, or who are just people whose paths would not have crossed but for Sorenson. And they spend all this time together, and you see them form friendships that last for years. Sometimes they hold reunions. And we've seen it even in the House of Delegates, where our alumni have these friendships across the aisle, which we think contributes to a healthier state of affairs in the legislature.
So even if a Democratic delegate and a Republican delegate in the Virginia House of Delegates were to still disagree ideologically on what ought to be done on issue X, right? They still may not vote together, but what you're saying is they can respect where the other person is coming from more and understand that the other person also wants to advance the best interest for Virginians and merely disagrees on what that constitutes the best interest and how to get there. Is that right?
That's right. And the way we run the programs, we really make it hard to just pigeonhole people into categories and stereotype them. They spend a lot of time together, and they get insight as to, sometimes with a political opponent, you'll ask yourself, how in the world could they possibly believe that? And it's easy to say then that there's, not good faith, or there's some bad motive for that. But in fact, often it's not. It's just people see things very differently, and I think Sorenson graduates have greater insight into that.
So so you said that there's some budget activities that go through. What other sort of components are there to a leadership institute? Many listeners may never have had any experience with having been part of a leadership institute. This may be something they might be interested in. They might just be interested in learning exactly what this is. So you're spending multiple weekends throughout the year doing different exercises and kind of like a mock legislature, or what else is it? Is it taking a tour of different parts of the state? Yeah,
all of the above. For example, on a very practical side, they might go and visit a business, and they might go visit a factory. They might go visit a coal mine or a port, where a lot of the commerce of Virginia is taking place. They might have an exercise where they're asked to discuss a particular public policy issue. We did one recently with the death penalty. It was a pretty controversial issue, and they got to decide for themselves which side of it they were going to be on, and they had a very civil discussion about a pretty emotional issue. And I think people surprised each other about who exactly ended up on which side of the issue and the reasons for it. And they got some insight into why people on the other side felt as they did.
So you mentioned, sorry, keep going?
Go on.
You mentioned a tension between ethos and logos, and it's an interesting insight. I was wondering, especially within the context of a death penalty conversation, once people had established relationships, were you seeing less emotion and more logic, or was there no real correlation between the time that they've been in the program and how much of either you might see?
I think people, the degree to which they view issues emotionally or logically is particular to them. But what we do to each of them, but what we do gives them insight as to how others reach their conclusions. And it makes it easier for people to debate in a useful way and a civil way that might actually lead to some kind of resolution.
So suppose the entire nation were to go through the Sorenson Institute. How would America look different after that were to take place?
Well, I think we'd have to do a lot of fundraising first to make that happen. But I think there's one thing we see. People are sort of dividing into camps. That's always been true, but it's more true lately. And part of the reason is people feel almost, when they're not meeting those who are different, it's easier to impute malice or to suggest bad motives for people on the other side, or just decide that they're stupid or ignorant. What we do is we make it hard to believe those things, because people are at close quarters, and we put a premium on discussion and getting out of your comfort zone to talk with people who have different views. And it's a cliche, but that works. People who are obliged to talk with those who disagree with them politically, if they are listening, they learn things. So
it sounds like a big, I guess, value, a grand value at the Sorenson Institute is to humanize the other, those with whom one might disagree. You need to recognize their humanity, and by going out of your comfort zone and seeing where the other person is coming from, you may or may not be persuaded of the merits of their argument, but you ought to be persuaded of the sincerity of their intentions. Is that pretty much what goes on?
I think that's a fair description, and you might also learn something you didn't know about how they reach their conclusions. Sometimes people want to say that people that they think are wrong are just ill-informed or not that bright or even malicious. Generally, in their own minds, people have very good reasons for the positions they hold. Right now we're having trouble in this country sometimes even agreeing about basic facts. But when you have a civil discussion among intelligent people and require people, we want people to be able to defend their position. So we encourage people to really know what the heck they're talking about. And but even informed people can disagree, and it's a useful exercise that we repeat over and over to get people together who don't always agree, and sometimes involve them in some kind of common undertaking. That budget exercise is one example of that.
So, Tom, we're approaching the end of this podcast, and I'd like to ask you a final question. I'd like to ask you to suppose that you're speaking to your students at GW, in your former capacity as a professorial lecturer there, and I'd like to ask you to talk to them, or perhaps to a constituent for one of the senators who you worked for. I'd like you to talk to them about why it is that you have worked to advance the public interest in so many different ways, through being a campaign or a legislative staffer, by running this political leadership institute, which by definition puts you in the same room as with those with whom you disagree, to the work you do as a volunteer on the side, and the pro bono work that you were able to do through all of your legal career. I'd like you to talk to these students or constituents and explain to them why it is that you found it valuable to do all these things, especially at the expense of leaving a more lucrative career with the law firms, and then what you hope your legacy will be at the end of your career after having given so much to advance the public interest.
Well, that's a long question. Let's see. I guess I'm drawn to it because, as I said in the beginning, I just feel like I've had a lot of opportunity growing up in this country, and it sort of seems like a natural thing to do. And I would add that if you look around and you define it broadly, most of the people you meet are involved in some kind of service. But I'm drawn to the political version of service, and in the past that's been in campaigns and working on Capitol Hill, and now it's taking this other form. But what I have always been interested in is politics and government that really does represent people and gets things done for them and makes them feel as though they're being looked out for because it all belongs to them. And so I've just tried to work in a way consistent with that. And I've been really fortunate to do it in some pretty interesting contexts.
Mm-hmm. So that has been Tom Walls, Executive Director of Sorenson Institute for Political Leadership at the University of Virginia, a former principal at Denton's U.S. LLP, the former partner at McGuire Woods Law Firm, a former professorial lecturer in law at George Washington University, a former Hill staffer for Senators Bumpers, Feingold, and Warner, and a double who. Tom talks about public service as a means of promoting ethics and integrity in government, in politics, and in society. He has worked throughout his career to promote civility, to he's spoken about how perception matters, and perception can often become reality, and that there's an importance to humanize one another within the political realm and ensure that even if somebody has a different opinion, that you're able to speak with them, develop relationships with them, see where they come from. When you make an argument, ensure that you're coming from a knowledgeable place where you're making your argument based on facts and a real understanding, a substantive understanding of the issues. For Tom, public service is about promoting discussion, ensuring that, and promoting mutual understanding. And he really has emphasized the importance of including diversity in those conversations. And public service for Tom is about ensuring that there are more opportunities, that he can work throughout his career to create more opportunities to have a diverse group of people get together, discuss, recognize each other's humanity, and do work to advance the public interest. So, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jordan.
And this has been episode 131 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. Remember to subscribe at publicinterestpodcast.com. Listen on iTunes, your podcast app on Apple products, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Blueberry, Player FM, Facebook, and Twitter. Should you wish to speak to Tom, you can leave a voicemail for him at 240-630-0380, and that voicemail will be emailed to him. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.